Well, it's 7:30 in the morning, and the job I was given was to give a 30,000-foot overview of the economy going forward. A daunting task, particularly this early in the morning. Before I start, I'm reminded of a comment that Yogi Berra once made about how difficult predictions are to make, particularly when they concern the future. So we just want to keep that thought in mind as we go forward, and I'll try to make this as painless as possible. And you want me to take about 15 minutes, right, Pat? Okay, great. Let me tell you how I'm going to do this today. What I've done, there's a report produced quarterly by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and it basically surveys all professional forecasters, economic forecasters out there. So what I want to do is go over their most recent forecast, which was published in late August of this year. They've been doing this for a long time. They rely upon the forecast of companies and economists who use a variety of different forecasting methods. Some use very complex quantitative models. Some use more subjective and survey-based research methods. So the forecasters aren't biased in any particular methodology or not. And what they fundamentally do is ask questions about what's your median forecast, what's the range of your forecast on GDP growth, on inflation, et cetera. And I want to just go through that. There actually are 48 professional forecasters, that's a typo, that are in this study, and they're all members of the National Association for Business Economics. And that's what I want to go over today. They provide three fundamental categories of forecasts. The first one has to do with economic growth, or just the size of the economy. Their first prediction is one of what the real gross domestic product will be in the economy. Real gross domestic product is just the value of all goods and services adjusted for inflation. Over time, it gives us a sense of how the economy is growing or contracting, at what pace it's growing, et cetera. Historically, in the United States in the post-World War II period, this number's been about 3% per year. And the third bullet point lists the median forecast going forward. This current year, they're predicting an annualized rate of growth of about 2.2%, which is well below the long-run average. And they have that number going down in 2013 and then trending back up towards 2014. Let me just say a couple things about this. The 2012 number is for the whole year. If you look at their quarterly forecast for the third and fourth quarter, they're lower than 2.2. There's a trend amongst economic forecasters of predicting less economic growth towards the end of the year than we've seen in the first part of the year. Secondly, the 2013 number, that reflects to some extent the concerns that economic forecasters have about fiscal cliff and fiscal policies going into next year, and whether or not that'll have a contractionary effect on the economy. The 2014 to 2015 numbers, you can all see that trending back towards the long-run norm in economic growth. You shouldn't believe that at all. That's just what all economic models, if you predict out far enough, they predict the past. That's all they're doing. So they're just going back to that 3.1 number. There's a fair amount of economic literature being developed today suggesting that the long-term economic growth rates have fundamentally changed, that they're going to be lower. They're more in the order of 2.0, et cetera. Those have not been incorporated into economic forecasts like this before. They may be entirely right, but all they're doing is predicting the past, predicting that if we go out far enough into the future, it'll look like the past, and that's all that's going on. The last bullet point here predicts is a forecast of the probability that the economy will actually contract in one of the quarters going out. You can see that probability starting off in this quarter at about 13% and climbing to the first quarter of next year to 21, a little over 21%, and then abating. Again, what I think the economic forecasters are doing there is anticipating a bit what the federal government intends to do with respect to the extension of the Bush-era tax cuts, with respect to the sequester and the contraction in government spending over this period of time. So there's a great deal of that. I would suspect that over the past, since this report was issued in August, late August, they probably have revised these numbers up a bit. There's a little bit more contractionary pressure in the economy than there was in August. Unemployment, the long run, the natural rate of unemployment is thought by many to be 6%, and that's just the level of unemployment associated with a well-functioning economy where people quit jobs to look for new jobs and things like that. In 2012, the forecasters are forecasting unemployment over 8%. That's about 12.5 to 15 million people, depending upon how you count this. They see the numbers trending down over time. Once again, These numbers reflect an instinct amongst economic forecasters that things will go back to their long-run averages eventually. There's a category called underemployed, and these are people who are employed in positions that don't fully utilize their qualifications, or positions that they don't want but they can't find the positions that are out there. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tries, this is obviously an imaginary number that requires a lot of subjective judgment to compute. The Bureau of Labor Statistics thinks this number is somewhere in the 12 to 18% range. You can always find people who claim it's much higher. The third bullet point identifies something that's gone on that's very interesting, and that is a drop in workforce participation rates. This is just the percentage of gainfully employed adults, 18 to 65-year-old people that are actually seeking employment or are employed. You can see that since 2000, this number has fallen down 4 or 5 percentage points. One interesting thing to note is that between 2008 and 2012, the number of people employed and looking for employment has essentially stayed the same, even though our country has grown about at the same pace that it has over the past 20 or 30 years. So there's a bit of a trend towards people leaving the workforce. This could be fine if it's done within the context of a family structure where people, you have one breadwinner and other people stay at home. The concerning element of workforce participation these days is that the many people leaving the workforce are young people, people between the ages of 25 and 35 who can't find employment. They leave and go back home. Just as a last point, recall that we need about 3% GDP, real GDP growth to keep unemployment at the same level as it is before. Recall that all the forecasts have this number below 3.0% going forward, so one should anticipate unemployment not improving over the near term. Talk a little bit about the foundations for low growth. All of you remember your macroeconomics class from college, right? GDP equals consumption plus business investment plus government spending plus net exports. So let's just go through that. What's the consumer sector doing? Well, they're not doing anything that suggests that the economy will come roaring back. Incomes are stagnant in households or declining. If you look at statistics on median household income, they've actually contracted a great deal over the course of this recession. If you look at unemployment and underemployment, they're rather tremendous, and that affects the household sector tremendously. There's considerably deleveraging in household sectors. Households are trying to work off their home loan debt, their credit card debt, to the extent they can, their student loan debt. There's a big attempt to reduce spending and fix the household balance sheet, and that has a contractionary effect as well. And of course, there's just the innate level of uncertainty out there in the economy affects households' decisions to buy new homes, to buy new cars, to make large durable purchases that will drive the economy, and all of it tends to be leaning towards the negative now. Business investment keys off consumer spending and government spending, and of course there's not a lot of incentive for businesses to invest a lot these days. They tend to be doing well on a balance sheet point of view. They tend to be making profits, but the profit growth potentials aren't out there, and there's a fair amount of uncertainty plaguing business decision making as well. Uncertainty around tax policy, uncertainty around regulatory policy. So the business side is not really good. Under government spending, I have a highly technical term that I put in there. The government sector is a mess around the world. It's a mess on the balance sheet, and what's fundamentally going on there is that there's just way too much debt compared to the tax revenues that are being taken in at any given level. Japan is a classic example. You know, GDP to debt to GDP ratios over 100%, which means that a lot of the tax revenues that are being taken in are being used to service the debt as opposed to pay for schools, pay for fire departments, you know, do the normal things you would do that would cause the economy to grow. So that's a big mess there. There's some fairly good economic research that I could point you to that talks about the effects that high debt to GDP ratios in the public sector have on economic growth. The authors of this research are Cameron Reinhart and Ken Rogoff, and they just take you through step by step how high debt in the public sector is a retardant on economic growth, and that's a tough spot here. And net exports, there's tremendously slowing global economic growth. If you look at the import-export data, even out of the Asia sector over the past 2 to 3 months, it's almost like it got shut down. There's very little economic trade going on out there. Europe is a big drag on economic growth and likely to get worse from the net export sector. There are just no pockets of economic growth in the world that the United States could point to as being a big source of net export growth in our economy. So there really aren't any drivers of economic growth that one can easily see out there. Inflation historically has been slightly below 4%. The median forecast of both headline and core CPI, core being CPI stripped out with energy and food prices and stuff stripped out, are below that. The long run forecast, again, are just basically what's going on right now. I think there's a couple things to be said about inflation. In my opinion, inflation is a desired policy of the Fed. I mean, the Fed does not want price deflation, to have asset deflation, which will further contract the economy. So I think these numbers are actually a floor. I think 2% and 3% inflation is a floor. I think the Fed will print as much money as they need to make sure that we don't get in a deflationary situation. Whether or not it gets out of control and we get into more of a hyperinflation type situation depends upon the Fed's ability to manage liquidity if economic growth were to ever return. So I think, in my view, inflation is an entirely managed activity these days and determined by the Fed. And I think these or slightly higher numbers are going to be pretty good predictions of where we're going to go. Okay, on time so far? Okay. This is my last slide. This is just the view from 30,000 feet over the next 3 or 4 years. Slow economic growth, I'd put the growth anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 with a possibility of some contractionary quarters depending upon government policy. Improving private sector balance sheets. I think households and corporations' balance sheets look pretty good. The debt has been worked down to a very large extent amongst most parts of those sectors. This is not true with kind of middle income or lower middle income families within the United States, but they're improving a bit. Dramatically deteriorating public sector balance sheets. Entitlement spending, unemployment benefits, the kind of support, the safety net support that you see in times like this are going to continue to put a demand on public sector expenditures. There's going to continue to be a resistance to increase taxes because that's a contractionary effect. So you can see the public sector balance sheets deteriorating quite a bit. High unemployment, high underemployment, continuing for the foreseeable future. I think more people will leave the workforce. Low interest rates, low-ish inflation. Again, depending upon the Fed's ability to manage that activity. And I think not a lot of economic growth, but perhaps some shifting in the way in which consumers spend money, maybe more towards the necessities of life, more towards things they have to have. Energy, healthcare, possibly education. There may be just the way to think about the future may be to think about it less of how you spend the new dollars that you get into households and more how the existing dollars are going to be reallocated by households to satisfy the needs that they face going forward. So in general, I hate to do this to you this early in the morning, a pessimistic view. I think it's the consensus view, and all of you read and stay informed enough to understand the background behind all this. But headwinds ahead.
What I would like to take you through is, there are probably several healthcare trends, but I want to take you through 5 sentinel healthcare trends that we can expect over the coming years. The first one is that healthcare reform is here to stay. What we do have is version 1.0, and irrespective of what you think will happen with the general elections coming up in November, healthcare reform is going to have to continue, and that's because it's underpinned by economic imperatives, both from the governmental and private sectors. We are spending in the United States twice as much as the average per capita expenditure, and that is not resulting in twice the benefit of other countries. In fact, the Commonwealth Fund did a study of healthcare quality in the United States and other industrialized countries and found that we score either last or next to last in 10 of 12 metrics of quality. Most of this has to do with maldistribution. If you have insurance, you get high quality healthcare typically. If you don't have insurance or are underinsured, then you typically experience the lower end of that. But in aggregate, we do poorly as a country. We have a system that suffers from fragmentation. Where other industries have entered the digital age, we are slow in healthcare to do so. We have a lot of fragmentation. Most physician practice occurs in groups of 4 or less. My group, such as Kelsey-Seybold, is unusual in coordinated systems of care, but there are plenty of other examples around the country where this is demonstrated to be successful at controlling cost and improving quality. What we have for healthcare reform, and I think the most important contribution of what we have today, is that it has finally started the process of reform. Reform has been starts and stops, mostly in stops, for the last arguably 15 to 100 years, depending on when you say that we first started seeking healthcare reform, but is now underway. In fact, it's rolling towards us, and unless we correct what's wrong, we will suffer from the deficits and not have the full benefit of the good parts. It will probably be an election cycle to get to version 2.0 and another election cycle to get to 3.0, but it is going to have to be adjusted over time. But going back and staying where we were is just not possible from an economic and global competitive sense. So this will be an ongoing issue of healthcare, and particularly with focus on cost. Part of the major thrust of healthcare reform has been insurance reform and extending coverage to a broader population. And much of that is Medicaid expansion, at least half of it. We know in the short term, at least, that Medicaid expansion will not occur in Texas, at least according to the predictions of Rick Perry, who probably knows whether it's going to happen or not. When we have broader coverage throughout the population, we get several beneficial things. One is that we move away from taking care of patients when they need rescuing and start taking care of patients when they need prevention. Rescue care is always much more expensive. Anything that you know that can happen bad, when you wait to the last minute to correct it, it's always much more expensive. That's certainly true in healthcare. So if we move to prevention, then we can have longer lives and not have to do quite so much rescue care, which is so expensive with the public safety net hospitals. There will be then relief for local taxpayers that support these safety net healthcare systems and hospitals. So there will be some reduction in cost, and this is an untold story about healthcare reform, is that there will be offsetting savings in the public sector that will help. However, it is true that if you have insurance today through an employer or through a private purchase, that the cost of your healthcare insurance is going to go up as a result of healthcare reform. It is because of bringing in the patients who, because of high risk, could not be insured before this, and bringing it into the health insurance risk pool, and then limiting the amount of underwriting that can be done, instead of from an 8-to-1 ratio of highest rated to lowest rated, collapsing that down to a 3-to-1 ratio based only on gender and geographic location and smoking status. That means that those that benefited because they were healthy will have to pay more to pay for the ones that are coming into the risk pool that previously couldn't get insurance. It will allow insurance to occur beyond the tight coupling with employer-based insurance, so it will allow some increased mobility between companies, and will, I think, add some lubricant to the economy as people can move into employment arrangements that they are better suited for. But overall, the cost of insurance will increase, but with offsetting benefits. Healthcare will become accountable, not just more accountable, but accountable, because it is not accountable as it is today or it has been in the past. One of the outcomes of healthcare reform is the notion of accountable care organizations. And we will be moving from fragmentation of healthcare into systems that seek to manage the total cost and quality of care and increase the value of the healthcare that we receive. This will require heavy investment in medical management programs, information, infrastructure investments, and then hewing to a scientific-based evidence-based approach to healthcare rather than opinion-based and regional norms. We will move from payment on a fee-for-service basis, which basically pays for volume but not for value, or not whether or not that volume is necessary. In most instances of human economics and enterprise, we operate on a fee-for-service system. Think of getting your car repaired, or getting your house cleaned, or engaging professional services such as legal services. You get a service, you pay for the service, and we're accustomed to that. In the case of healthcare, though, because there is such a mismatch between the providers of healthcare and the consumer of healthcare, that the consumer doesn't know what they need, and this is an industry that can induce its own demand. I don't mean to suggest that that providers of healthcare wake up trying to induce demand, but that's what happens as an outcome of a fee-for-service system where the approach to controlling cost is to discount all of the fees that accumulate to make the total cost of healthcare, but not taking into account the effect that has on utilization. If you discount all the fees, what the natural response to that is for providers of healthcare to increase the volume of services they provide, thinking on the surface that they're helping more people, but actually they are moving towards the part of the distribution curve where we are providing care that is increasingly less beneficial for patients, and in some cases actually harmful for patients. What we'll move to, though, instead is a system of prepayment for a population of patients to achieve attractive healthcare outcomes over a period of time. And this will be a much more accountable way to finance healthcare. We will also have, because of this investment in information technology, we will have the ability to report on service and medical care quality. So it won't be a return to the HMOs of old, but it'd be accountable for quality of service and clinical care as well. There are models of this style of care that have been in existence for decades, and they are successful. Examples include Intermountain Healthcare, Geisinger Clinic, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, Scott and White Clinic here in Central Texas, and Kelsey-Seybold Clinic in Houston, and there are just a number of them across the country. They range in age from over 100 years to, in the case of Kelsey-Seybold, 63 years and even younger. There are more of these systems that are developing in our state, and that is a good thing because it will coordinate the care and increase the value. We know that there's a lot of room for improvement. The Institute of Medicine recently released a white paper where they had concluded that 30% of U.S. healthcare is either minimally beneficial or not beneficial to patients. So we know that there is savings out there. In addition, there is evidence such as the Dartmouth Atlas of Healthcare, in which Dartmouth looks at Medicare claims across the country, and they see huge variability. For the total cost of care to take care of a Medicare beneficiary, it is 3 times more expensive in Miami than it is in Minneapolis. But human biology doesn't vary by 3-fold, but certainly the cost and approach to care does. And there are some instances where specific procedures are done 10 times more frequently in some locations than in others, and there can be a lot of variability even in adjacent regions. So this variability indicates that we are not focused on the optimal norm, but rather we are ranging way too high and way too low, and that's causing this huge variability. And accountable care systems seek to eliminate that variability and just condense it around the optimal approach to common problems. Because of the Accountable Care Act and because of this bringing of high risk into the insurance pool, employers that are now fully insured are likely to move into the self-funded arrangement for providing their health care benefits. And some employers may actually go to a defined contribution plan where they give their employees a set amount of money and send them out into the exchange to buy it on an individual basis. Each employer, though, will have the greatest value for the dollars that they spend if they remain in the health benefits providing business for their health benefits for their employees. But self-funding will be advantageous to them because they will only be exposed to their own risk, but not the new risk of difficult to insure patients with higher healthcare needs. They'll be coming into the risk pool. In addition, they will not be exposed to some of the risk mitigation strategies that will be applied in the insurance market. And then lastly, they won't be paying the 2% fee that will be imposed on insurance that won't occur in self-funding. So today, 53% of all healthcare benefits are provided on a self-funded basis by the employer, but that will move down into the medium size and the smaller employers and moving into self-funding. My last trend here is that there will be a physician shortage. It's easy to predict a trend that is already partially true, and that's the case in this case. We do have a shortage in Texas. Texas ranks 45th out of the nation in terms of the number of physicians per 100,000 population. We have a large number of physicians that are of retirement age, and we have a fixed rate of replacement with medical graduates. And not all of those medical graduates here in Texas stay in Texas, but we do have some that come from other states that balance that out. We do know that we're going to have increasing demand as we expand the insured pool of patients and we go more to preventative care rather than rescue care. There'll be an increased demand. Maybe not quite as much in Texas if we don't expand Medicaid coverage as occurs in other parts of the country, but we'll have to rely more upon care being delivered by the allied health professions. And we do know that at some level that access to care will be limited by supply. That's already the case in rural Texas, and that may also extend into urban areas as well. So that concludes my remarks, Pat.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also a pleasure to follow Dr. Berthelsen. I think when we talk about technology, even healthcare is a great example of where technology permeates, and we're taking a very active role ourselves in helping with these initiatives in electronic medical records, for example, or mobile clinical computing, where doctors can be much more productive in looking at patient records around the world. But the area that I'm most excited about is what's happening with technology in genomic research. And we've been involved most recently with initiatives like TGen, where you are now able to, in a matter of hours, evaluate the effectiveness of chemotherapy on various different kinds of cancers and really help individuals understand what their options are. So, you'll hear in my discussion today about how technology pretty much permeates every aspect of the world right now. From a business standpoint, technology is down in its growth, and that's happening around the world, as we heard from Dean Gilligan's comments, but there are a lot of pockets of growth that are happening, and they relate to some of the trends that I want to talk about today. The trends that I want to talk about in technology relate to some important business trends that have to do with the way the world is operating right now. First of all, there's a need for increased productivity, which is a nice way of saying people have to cut their costs. So we'll talk about some of the trends that are leading to that from a technology standpoint. Then there is accessing new markets. Many businesses now around the world are trying to find new areas of growth. So I'll talk about emerging markets and the technology trends that lead to that. And lastly is the need to get more out of your customers. And that really has prompted a desire to have a more personalized relationship with customers, and we'll talk about the technology trends leading to that. So first, let's talk about productivity. Two real areas that I would look at from a technology trend standpoint. First one is that most institutions are looking to modernize their infrastructures. And really the big trend that's happening in technology is a movement to standards-based computing. And this is a big change in our industry because most large institutions have traditionally run their businesses on very proprietary platforms, and you've all heard about mainframes, and some people think, I think the younger generation imagines that the mainframe is gone, but it's actually still pretty pervasive around the world, but they are on a rapid decline now because technology advances in computing speeds and in the performance of processors have now gotten to the point where there's not a need to have proprietary technology. So, we're seeing, for example, in our networking and storage equipment, transfer speeds over the internet of 40 gigabytes now, which is amazing. Just a few years ago, it was a fraction of that. So that's enabling a substantial movement towards standard-based computing. And we see that in our business because even though technology spend is down generally around the world, our server business is growing quite a bit, and that's because of this movement. Probably the more interesting discussion around productivity that this audience can relate to is the phenomena that's being referred to now as bring your own device. This is an interesting phenomenon to me because it's merging a social movement with now a good business decision on how to cut costs. So for quite some time now, with the emergence of smartphones and tablets, and also consumers caring more about design, there's been a growing pressure on institutions to allow their employees to bring their device into the workplace and not have multiple devices. Now, this has been resisted for quite some time because of the complexity, but now it's being viewed as a cost-saving opportunity. And it really expands even into the connected workplace where people, employees, again, particularly the younger generation, is desiring to have a much different workday. They want to work at home, they want to work different hours, and technology now is affording the ability to do that, but it's now also being viewed as a way to cut costs. So when I visit many customers around the world, they're all looking for how do I implement this bring your own device because it allows me to maybe not spend as much on my computers and let the employee make the purchase. But there's significant complications in this right now. Security is probably the #1 issue that has to do with this phenomena. Most of the devices that are out there today have been approached almost exclusively through the eyes of the consumer and not considering the needs of the business. So for example, since our business is about 80% related to institutions, as Windows 8 comes out as a tablet, we're focusing much more on the security of the environment and the manageability of the environment as opposed to, say, maybe an Apple that's really focused on a consumer user experience. Businesses are telling us, well, they like that device, it's giving them a lot of headaches in the workplace. So this whole movement nets out to it's a strong desire for employers to utilize it, but they don't know how to do it. And so I think you're going to see over the coming years a lot of interesting platforms being developed. We are working on some ourselves to make this a secure, manageable environment, and I believe that you will see pervasive use of people bringing their technology into the workplace, having things like split software images where you have your personal work image and it's completely separated from your business image. So that's productivity. On the expansion, emerging countries, emerging markets is truly related to the growth of technology. I think there's if you have just a U.S. lens and looking at technology, you would think, well, growth rates are going to be low. But when you look at the very low penetration rates of technology in China and India, Indonesia, throughout Africa, Brazil, you can quickly get very encouraged about the fact that technology, including the PC, is going to continue to have substantial growth. Now, for businesses and institutions, this is also a great source of growth. And there are some interesting technology trends that are lowering the barriers to entry. And they have to do with e-commerce and with cloud computing. And let me explain a little bit on cloud computing. So I think most people have heard that term enough, but it really refers to the ability to have software managed in a central place and you access that software rather than having it on premise. Well, you know, this is pretty profound in terms of small and medium businesses that want to expand globally. Because in the past, you would have to set up an office in a foreign country and you'd have to put infrastructure there. Because of cloud computing, you can access now customers, you can access supply chains, you can access all kinds of competitive information without even having a physical presence in a country. And so cloud computing is really catching on as a trend because it's enabling a leveling of the playing field for any size business to enter any market around the world. E-commerce, of course, has been around for a long time, but we're seeing another explosion of e-commerce around the world. You know, people are all familiar with Amazon in the U.S. Alibaba in China has plans to exceed the revenue of Walmart in just a few more years, you know, as the Amazon of China. And so this is fueling a substantial growth in technology to power all of this e-commerce. For Dell, it's another reason our servers are growing, because we are the power behind all of these search engines around the world. So I think reaching new customers is going to require technology, and that's why you're going to see continued growth in the area of cloud computing. The last trend that I'll talk about is this personalization and getting more out of a customer and reaching more customers. There are several trends going on here. I'll talk about two of them. The first one is generally referred to as big data. And what this means is that there is now a massive amount of information available about consumers. It's so massive that it's difficult to make any sense of it. And there are emerging software technologies and hardware technologies that are all about condensing data, analyzing data, and helping to gain insights out of information. And you will see a very big trend growing in technology space on how to get that kernel of information about a particular customer in such a way that you could target market a specific product or service to them. And you're seeing companies attempt to do this, like Groupon is a really good example, where they gather customer information, they assess it, and then they try to target coupons to those customers. I think that's just at the forefront. I wouldn't say that that's proving to be dramatically successful at this point in time, but it's a good indication of what's happening. The second trend that I'll talk about is social media. Social media is probably one of the most cost-effective ways to find out about your customers and your competition. If not done properly, all you will get is anecdotes. Anyone can go onto a site and look at the comments, or go to a blog and look at the comments, and try to determine a conclusion out of that. It's really impossible to do that. All you're going to get is anecdotal information. But there are now a lot of technologies available to create what we call, and we have one of these, is a social media command center. You actually have the capability to assess every comment that's being made about your institution or your industry or your competitors and put it into categories of positive, negative, neutral, good trends, bad trends, and you can actually act on it. You can participate in the conversation in an above-board way and influence the outcomes of what people think about your business. You can also gain tremendous competitive insights and understand what trends are either positively or negatively affecting your competition. And so you're seeing a huge trend in companies that previously wouldn't even allow their employees to access Facebook in the office, and now using social media as one of their primary marketing engines. So these are the major trends that we're seeing in technology, and I think they all relate to, they're all driven by what's going on in the economy as they really propel institutions and businesses to think of new ways to grow and cut costs. Thank you.
I'm going to talk today about the outlook for energy globally, but focusing mostly on the United States. I'm going to talk, if you know the components of energy at all, you know it's predominantly made up of commodities. And if you think about commodities, the story there is really supply and demand. So we're going to talk, Dean Gilligan really talked a lot about the demand side. I'll touch on that as it relates specifically to commodities and energy commodities, but I'll also spend most of my time on the supply side. And I'll also touch on the notion of U.S. energy independence in our lifetime, which is the subject of much political debate these days. After 3 decades, since the early 70s, of falling U.S. oil production, in the last few years, we've seen a dramatic change in that picture and an increase in oil production in the United States, and we're going to dive into that a little bit. This has profound implications beyond our energy security. This has implications for capital investment, this has implications for job growth, and this has implications for our balance of payments and our export-import imbalance. And then near and dear to our hearts, this has big implications for Texas, because a lot of this investment and job growth is occurring and would occur in the state of Texas. Citibank's chief commodities economist, Daniel Ahn, he estimates that over $200 to $300 billion of new annual revenue could be created with this investment, and that would create an additional 2 to 3.5 million jobs here in the United States. Big implications for our economy. So with that, let's get started. Let's start by looking at the big picture. The energy industry is a big part of our economy. It's about $2.2 trillion in terms of publicly listed companies on our American exchanges. And those companies invested about $318 billion in capital in last year alone. So it's a big sector in our economy. And on the left, you can see the energy sources, where you can see oil and gas make up about 60% of the total, with the balance coming from coal, nuclear, and renewables. When you look at how we use our energy on the right, electric power and transportation really dominate the picture with about 70% of the total there. Now, the mix of the fuel needed to fuel the pie on the right is quite varied. For example, electricity is about 50% fueled by coal today, 20% natural gas, 20% nuclear, and about 10% from alternatives. On the other hand, transportation is over 90% based on oil. Industrial is a real mix, 40% oil, 40% gas. Residential, commercial, about 75% natural gas. And these commodities really vary in the whole equation of where they are and what it takes to get them out commercially and how much it costs. And that's what we're going to focus on. So let's look at the future. On slide 3, we expect natural gas and renewables to be the fastest growing sectors on a percentage basis. But at the same time, over the next 10 to 15 years, we don't see renewables really exceeding the 10% level in terms of meeting our energy needs today. It's just too small to move the needle at this point. And those renewables will continue to rely on favorable legislation and subsidies for that sector to grow. On the other hand, while oil and gas, oil in particular, and coal will grow at a slower rate, we think it'll continue to make up over 50% of our energy supply for this foreseeable future. And then in terms of capital investment, which drives jobs, we think 85% of the near-term future capital investment is going to go to oil and gas development and the services around them, including transportation, midstream, and refining. And only 15% will go to utilities, coal, and renewables. So let's talk, this is my slide on the demand side. Let's talk about the drivers, again, supply demand, what drives the price and behaviors of particularly oil and gas. On the left is oil and right is gas. So oil is a worldwide market. It's more easily and commercially to move. It's transported by sea very easily. And the macro drivers for there are really the big economies in the world. The United States, Europe, and now China and India. Those economies are going to really drive the demand side for oil. And on the other hand, the supply side has been dominated by the Middle East and OPEC countries like Venezuela. And we see that picture changing. On the right, natural gas is more isolated to the United States or North America. Transportation costs are a challenge. However, with the emergence of liquefied natural gas and the ability to move natural gas by ship, we see that could change into more of a global market. Natural gas has been particularly volatile in the last 5 years. We've seen it spike to $10 to $12 an MCF only 3 or 4 years ago, and then it's reduced to less than $3 an MCF for much of this year. So, a lot of change happening on the natural gas picture. Natural gas demand is very seasonal. In the summer, it's used a lot for air conditioning and for power, and in the winter, it's used for heating. So the seasonal demand is quite high, and last year's mild winter drove us to record storage levels in part, which again drove prices lower this year. The other thing happening with gas is switching. You'll see that sometimes if you read the energy rags. That's been a big theme this year, where natural gas, coal-fired power plants have the ability to switch, many of them, to natural gas. So we've seen a lot of that. And then for both oil and gas, U.S. legislation and regulation are big drivers, both in terms of supply and demand behavior. Okay, so I'm going to take a minute to talk about crude oil. Much of what I say, restrained on time, applies to gas, particularly in logistics. But let's focus on crude oil for a second. This is a great picture. It looks back at U.S. oil production since 1950. And notice how domestic oil production has increased dramatically in the last couple of years as higher oil prices attract investment and producers find ways to apply new technologies at old oil resources, conventional plays, as well as new resource plays, the shale boom, which really only began a few years ago. So over the 3-year period from 2009 to 11, the U.S. contributed more incremental oil supply than any other country on the planet. Think about that. The U.S. contributed more over that 3-year period than any OPEC country out of the Middle East. Simmons & Company forecast is shown here through 2015. They have a low base and high case, and their low case reflects a 60% increase in U.S. oil production. That's the low case. Their base case takes us back to near peak levels of the 1970s and early 80s. This is a radical shift in the oil picture for the United States. Harold Hamm, the CEO of Continental Resources, testified last month to the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, and he said this: America is endowed with an estimated 140 billion barrels of recoverable oil. That's enough to replace Persian Gulf imports for the next 50 years. That's a big change. The Manhattan Institute said it this way: a complete reversal in thinking is needed to orient North America around hydrocarbon abundance. Quite a shift from the days I grew up, of waiting in line at gas stations and so on. So what does that do? That was a production slide. Now let's look at imports. This is a picture of U.S. crude imports, so it's only logical that as our domestic U.S. oil production increases, our imports will decrease. And you can see here that Simmons believes our imports will decrease by 30 to 50% over the next few years. The high case would mean a reduction on our dependence on foreign imports to drop from over 60% a few years ago to less than 30% by 2015. The other half of that story is that imports could be further reduced by switching to natural gas. I mentioned switching for power, but some of you have been hearing about compressed natural gas, or CNG, lately. And there are cities like Fort Worth, Salt Lake City, Columbus, Ohio, Kansas City that have already switched their mass transit bus systems over to CNG fleets. Those costs per gallon on a per gallon equivalent basis are less than half of the cost of gasoline today. So big incentives for these big fleets to convert over to CNG. We're seeing short-haul fleets convert, these large fleets of commercial vehicles, much cheaper to run on natural gas, and they're switching over. And then in the oil field, they're big users of energy. They're switching from diesel to natural gas for hydraulic fracturing, pressure pumping equipment for hydraulic fracturing, as well as drilling rigs. So as that happens, that will again further reduce these imports for foreign oil. Next several slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about infrastructure. You can see also some supply implications for oil, but this is oil infrastructure in the United States. There are 3 big areas that are kind of on fire right now, 2 of them right here in Texas. So let's take for a minute, this is the Permian Basin, which is in West Texas. And you can see the solid black and dotted lines. They represent recent and forecasted production from Simmons and Company just for this basin. And the red and the green areas are pipeline and refining capacity, which is needed to move the production. We've seen bottlenecks, and in fact, WTI, West Texas Intermediate, the price for crude here in this state, much of it is quite a discount to what the price sells for overseas, what is called Brent in the North Sea. So if you think about what you buy gasoline for at the gas station, you should be glad you're not in Europe, because it's quite a bit more expensive over there based on that differential. But here in the Permian in West Texas, you can see a 77% increase in pipeline capacity over this 5-year period alone. This is what's required to handle the forecasted production, and much of this is not going to come on until the second half of next year, so we won't see a relief in price on the midstream side until then. It will be significant capital investment. The next major basin is the Bakken oil field in North Dakota. It's really the same story. They're experiencing a dramatic infrastructure growth. Much of the oil produced up there is moved out by rail, and the rail companies have had quite a boon on that. But over time, it's going to make sense to build the pipelines, and you can see the chart here with this projected growth. A 64% increase in Bakken midstream capacity to 2 million barrels a day by 2015 per Simmons and Company. And then lastly, the Eagle Ford in South Texas here. They've had tight capacity initially. You can see it in the chart. They were able to quickly bring on new pipelines. The legislature is favorable in Texas to do that. They got the permits quickly, and they were able to come online to meet demand, up 65% from 2012 levels. So these three areas, the Permian in West Texas, the Bakken in North Dakota, and the Eagle Ford in South Texas, will see a combined 68% increase in midstream capacity by 2015. If I showed you the pictures, it's really the same story in natural gas. Different locations. You got the Haynesville in East Texas and Louisiana. You got the Marcellus up in Ohio and Pennsylvania. But it's the same story. It's a massive build-out and capital spend for energy infrastructure in the United States. The Interstate Natural Gas Association America estimates that natural gas industry alone will spend another $30 billion through 2015 on just natural gas infrastructure. During the last 12 months, U.S. midstream companies have invested $29 billion for oil and gas infrastructure. That's 1 year. So this capital investment is going to drive significant job growth, and it's also going to be, a lot of it will be right here in Texas. Let's shift and talk a little bit about natural gas for a second. This chart, I think, really tells the story. It's U.S. natural gas production since 1970, and you can see that we are producing at peak levels of natural gas. You remember the oil slide? We're just now making a rebound. Here, this is up and to the right chart, an enormous supply of natural gas. A lot of it is the shale boom, and a lot of it is really finding old reservoirs that weren't commercial and bringing them back on, because we have new technology, and we've commercialized technology, particularly horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, but also secondary and tertiary recovery. That's what QR Energy does. We're really in the later life of these fields, and we get in with CO2 flood and nitrogen floods that really allow old fields to be economic again. And so we have an abundance of natural gas in the United States, and you can see it on this chart. Just for a second on shale, I think a lot of you know, but shales are really tight rock formations. Most of conventional or historical oil and gas came out of loose sands that allow the oil or gas to flow more easily. But in the tight shales, it's more dense and difficult to flow, and so you need ways to break it up, and that's what fracking is all about. And that's been really the boom, and that's really only happened in the last 5 or 6 years. Since 06, 07 was the start of the shale boom. And it's now allowing us to produce enormous quantities of oil and gas in America at commercial prices. So speaking of prices, this is a one-pager that tries to tell it all. On the left, you see oil and gas prices, crude oil in the blue and gas in the red, and it's really a tale of two commodities. These two commodities for years would trade in tandem. Oil and gas prices tended to go up together or decline together, and they tended to hold what they called a BTU equivalent ratio of about 6 to 1. So a British thermal unit to produce a unit of energy required about 6 units of natural gas to 1 unit of oil. And so that was really the ratio that held up for years until lately. And now you can see that our oil prices are 4 standard deviations above the historic average since the early 70s, while natural gas is at 30-year lows. And so we've seen a big decoupling between the price of oil and natural gas. If you're a trader, this speaks arbitrage. The problem with the arbitrage is it takes long-term capital investment. It's not a day trade. And so we don't expect to see this relationship sync up again anytime soon. Though business investment, long-term business investment to build out infrastructure could allow that to happen. So, and finally, what I would say in conclusion is that I do believe U.S. energy independence is possible, particularly if you apply it to North America and things like the Keystone Pipeline get built to allow Canadian crude to come here and more of a free market approach. Oil imports are expected to fall below 1990s levels almost in any scenario, and rising domestic production will reduce our dependence on foreign oil. Switching to natural gas for transportation and other uses could close the oil import gap completely. So this would mean that U.S. capital investment and job growth would be significant in the coming years, especially in the oil and gas sector. However, I have to tell you, we're at a critical point in this country with respect to energy policy and energy decisions. And I hope that each of you will pay greater attention and be more aware of energy-related issues and do everything you can to influence your elected officials to help us develop resources and to eliminate our dependence on foreign oil.
Tom? If we could have our panelists come on up and grab a seat. Dean Gilligan is going to moderate for us a set of Q&A. We're going to go up and down the aisles and gather your questions together. First question is yours.
I mean, we're to finish at 9, is that correct?
Correct.
All right. So I will defer to the audience as soon as someone steps up. That'll be the idea. Dr. Berthelsen, thank you for your comments. Many people anticipate or talked about the ability of the Affordable Care Act to bend the cost curve to achieve economies. Do you see anything in version 1.0 that will actually achieve that?
Well, there are attempts to do that. In fact, the introduction of the concept of accountable care organization as it relates to Medicare is probably the best example. But that's accountable care organization sharply focused on Medicare, but it's been expanded well beyond that. Is being applied to the entire commercial insurance market. And I think over time that's the American innovation that is going to save us from what otherwise would be a centrally controlled healthcare economy. It is our best hope to control costs in the future.
Mm-hmm. Outstanding. Steve, I want to ask a self-serving question. With respect to big data, we're actually starting a master's program at McCombs next year in business analytics, which is about collecting, managing, and analyzing the kind of data that is being accumulated in commercial organizations these days. Mm-hmm. What does Dell anticipate the demand being generated by the need for companies to analyze the data that they receive more completely?
Well, I really believe it's going to be one of their highest priorities. And so the demand is going to be for talent, to analyze the information, and technology to process the information. But if you want to maintain a competitive advantage in the world, I mean, the world is getting to the point where it's really difficult to differentiate. And the way you're going to seek differentiation is by understanding those unique differences that exist in markets and in customers. And so this business analytics, is probably going to be the highest demand of most companies mm-hmm. in any industry mm-hmm. on how they approach their markets and how they try to differentiate themselves from customers.
And on the hardware side, from Dell's point of view, that's a mainframe driver? That's a driver
no,
and mainframe?
It's servers to do the processing of the data, but it's also a lot of storage, because you're storing all this information. And the real dilemma for companies is some data is needed immediately. Some data is needed in a year. The cost of storage varies dramatically depending on how you want to save that data. Yeah. And so the technology evolution that's happening is a concept called tiering, where you're able to figure out, for this piece of data, how do I want to store it in the most cost-effective way so that I can get at when I want to, right. but I don't have to spend the fortune to maintain it all.
Yeah. Cedric, I enjoyed your talk. I was a bit startled by it, right? In the past 2 or 3 or 4 years, we've basically internalized the notion that we're moving away from a hydrocarbon economy. And your idea is that we have an abundant supply of hydrocarbon resources out there, and we need, from a policy point of view, to turn more more towards those resources and commodities. How do you think we have a productive discussion about what our nation's energy policy should be? And do you think we have the capacity these days to kind of embrace a more hydrocarbon-centric policy?
It's a complicated question. There are a lot of facets. I think it's a great question. I think we live in a great country where we do embrace democracy and freedom, and I think that people have a voice. And, you know, I think everybody can relate to it. Everybody tends to, you know, in some way or another, touch energy, whether it's the price of their fuel or air conditioning in the summer or filling up the tank of their car. So I think it impacts everybody. I think we have a great environmental track record in this country, and we should be proud of that. Certainly compared to the rest of the world, we do a great job there. So I think when we look at the data, we can be rational about it and feel good that we can make more energy investment here. I also think that the consumers will pay for a little subsidy. I don't think they mind a little subsidy for some good things. You know, alternatives, if you're paying a 10% premium at the pump, it's not so bad. But to pay a 400% premium for some of these subsidies is really outrageous if consumers really knew the story. And so I think there's a lot of education that needs to go on for the people to influence the elected officials.
Yeah. Cedric, here's a question for you. Is hydraulic fracturing a viable and sustainable industry in Texas, and specifically with respect to available water supply and shortages?
Yeah, good questions, two parts. The hydraulic fracturing has been around since the 50s. You know, it was really invented back then, and it certainly has developed over the years, and it's increased in its application, particularly because of the price. It would have been commercially viable years ago had the price of oil or gas gone up. It's only recently gone up to the current levels. Is it viable? I think it absolutely is viable. I think the water supply issue is a challenge, but most of that water, over 90% of it, is recycled. So there's, I think the industry's done a good job and is able to meet the water needs pretty easily.
Interesting. I have a question for Dr. Berthelsen, and this indicates how little I know about this. One question is, where are we on a symptomatic deflection of top 3? This must be a doctor that wrote this because we can't read it.
Doctor can't read it either.
What was the last word, whoever wrote it? Diseases. Asymptomatic deflection of top 3 disease. Detection, okay. Are you a doctor? Oh, okay. You're qualified.
Get some prescriptions afterwards, huh?
So I'll answer that question with a general statement, is that despite all the doom and gloom about being a physician these days, there's tremendous scientific advance that's occurring. And what we can do for patients in terms of early detection and personalized medicine and being able to tailor chemotherapy, as was mentioned earlier, specifically to the best treatment for the patient, is advancing at a much more rapid rate than it ever has been in the past. So this could be another way that technology, instead of ever increasing the cost of care, could actually start to reduce the cost of care. So hope for this scientific advance to really improve our lives.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question to anyone in the panel. It says, what are the initiatives to take in order to protect our assets and help stimulate our economy?
Well, I'll start. I think one of the most important things is a very basic thing that relates to your discussion, and that's access to credit. The greatest source of growth in the economy comes from entrepreneurs and small businesses. And right now, they are constrained in getting their ideas to market. And the policies haven't really helped that. There's a lot of talk about making it easier for banks to loan money, but the banks are basically holding it because they're not really incented to take the risk with it. Right. And so I think if we could free up capital to entrepreneurial firms, it would have the greatest effect on economic growth.
So you think credit constraints are holding back the economy right now?
I would add on the energy front the same thing. I think you're just doing more to encourage domestic investment, and that'll protect our domestic energy assets.
Cedric, here's a pushback on your presentation. How would you address concerns that the increasing cost of energy exploration and extraction will make oil and gas prohibitively costly for consumers? Shouldn't we consider energy alternatives for society and the environment?
Yes. Well, I definitely think alternatives have a place, but that's what I was referring to in subsidies. Some of those alternatives require a 400% subsidy versus the price of an equivalent hydrocarbon base. And so, we can handle so much, but, for other countries are able to generate, I mean, China in particular is 90% coal. It's terrible for the environment, but they have a competitive advantage in terms of their cost structure that is significant compared to ours related to energy. So it just depends on your price tolerance and how much you're willing to pay for energy, but alternatives are not cheaper. They're very much more expensive today.
Here's kind of a fun question for everybody, and I'm going to force everybody on the panel to answer this one. For those of us with kids in high school looking at college soon, what type of education would provide the best value? UT Austin, right? What do you look for when hiring new talent? And Cedric, I know you have both a daughter here and you hire a lot of graduates from the university,
Yeah.
right? So maybe you can go first with it.
Sure. We certainly look for, kids that are bright and energetic, and I'll tell you, attitude's everything. So they come in with a, roll up your sleeves, go to work, and, there's no job beneath me kind of attitude. And, but they come in well-trained, and hopefully they have some idea of the type of business we are and what we're trying to do. And really a self-starter that is able to, for the most part, figure a lot of things out on their own and not need as much hand-holding. So I think that the University of Texas does a great job. We do get a lot of students from here, and it's been a great source of student talent for us.
Yeah. Steve?
Yeah, there's a few characteristics that I would look for. Clearly, problem solving is one of the greatest benefits you get out of going to a university, learning how to just tackle tough problems in tight time frames. And I think the people that excel in that have a great advantage in the workplace. Curiosity is another one that I'm very interested in. This is a world today where there are so many different options, and you need to be open-minded in your thinking and looking for different alternatives. And then we clearly look for early signs of strong leadership. People that can relate to others, can influence others, can get things done in a collaborative way. These are some excellent traits. As far as job markets, just observing where jobs are going right now, I'd have to say engineering is clearly an area where it seems like jobs are more plentiful than others. And then, of course, in this area of analytics, I think that, in fact, the combination of the two, a technical background with some business analytics, I think would be a pretty powerful combination.
In medicine, as we move from this fragmented system of healthcare to one that's more coordinated, collaboration skills will be at an absolute premium because we're going to have to coordinate things, and that only comes through daily collaboration, and so we'll seek that in the future.
Accountable care organizations, I'm a little bit vague about how those are structured. Are they populated by more than just doctors and nurses, or are there other kind of healthcare providers in that?
Yes. Yes, by nature they have to have all elements of the healthcare system involved in order to coordinate all those various pieces together. So it may be a virtual organization so that they're not all one entity, but certainly they have to have these collaborative connections in order to be able to coordinate the care across inpatient and outpatient spectrum of care.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. Bernanke asserts, this is the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, asserts that he can hold inflation at 2% while continuing to print money. What are your predictions on the future rate of inflation? This is clearly a cynical question. Written by one of my students. I think 2% is a lower bound. That's my answer. I think that's the big game we're playing, right? I mean, what we're in now, debt spirals typically end in currency debasement historically, and I think 2% is a really nice lower bound for what inflation is going to be. So I would think it's going to be a little bit higher. And do you guys have any predictions
I would
on
just
that?
like to see us focus more on the fundamentals. I don't like all this engineering going on. I'd rather see us work on getting businesses making products and services to grow the economy rather than figuring out ways to manipulate the currencies myself.
Yeah.
I've spent most of my career in the energy sector, finance side, and it's all about supply demand. Again, commodities. It's the market determines the price, and so what I worry about with the printing of money and the quantitative easing, it's like a great party on your credit card, but then the bill's going to come due, and it's a fundamental, like Steve's saying, and I don't know how we defy that gravity. If you look at case studies of other countries, we call them banana republics, but they didn't turn out so good. So I think it's frightening what we are doing in terms of printing money.
All right. Just one more question, and then if you all have other questions, that'd be great too. The concept of peak oil, Cedric, is that a dead idea, or is that still out there unless we get energy policy to take advantage of the abundance?
Yeah,
of
it
hydrogen?
was for years. You know, peak oil was the predominant thought, and anybody who tried to oppose it was viewed silly. And really, I think that's what that oil production chart I showed, where we have increased production, and we have found billions of barrels more of oil that was not commercial, and it is today. And we've known it was there, but we didn't think we'd ever be able to get it out economically, and today we can. And so, you know, I think this notion of peak oil is really turned on its head.
Dr. Berthelsen, we've kind of, I take it from your talk that you're referring to the Affordable Care Act as version 1, and you referred to version 2 and version 3, and we're on a path which involves more government control and government leadership in the healthcare business. Is that a productive path ultimately, do you think, or what's your hope for that?
The path of greater government control and leadership is, I think, is one of two paths. The alternate path is that we will have private sector innovation that will take us out of this fix that we're in. And I think that's what accountable care is going to do. If you look at the history of healthcare reform across the world and industrialized countries, is that for the most part they have resorted to central control, either at the premium level or the price or the fee level. The United States will be unique if we're able to use the concept of accountable care and coordinating these systems of care to raise the value, particularly control the cost. But I think that has a good chance of prevailing. If it doesn't, then we gravitate back into the central controlled type healthcare economy, which is not going to serve us well.
Interesting. Pat?
We're about to wrap up. I want to say thank you to all of our panelists, Dean Gilligan, Dr. Berthelsen, Steve Felice, Cedric Burgher. Our thanks to all of you. And as everyone in this room can see, there have been cameras out here this morning. For those of you who signed up for this event, in about a week, you are going to get an email from texasenterprise.org with a link to the event. You'll be able to share it with one and all in your office, friends, peers, coworkers, anybody. I also want to let you know that the next event for the texasenterprise.org speaker series is going to be Thursday, November the 1st, with Dr. Raj Raghunthan. If you're so smart, why aren't you happy, is the title of that one. And I have a second program note. Next year on February the 6th, Dr. Andrew Dillon, who is Dean of the UT School of Information and the Lewis Ewell Regents Professor of Information, he will be presenting Craving Information, Making Sense in a Data-Deluged World. And I say thank you also this morning to all of our supporting sponsors, to BB&T, Pierpont Communications, and Texas Mutual Insurance, and our thanks to the wonderful folks at the AT&T Conference Center for putting this all together. A final thank you to our speakers. Have a good day.
Thank you.